David settled into his seat on the flight from Salt Lake City to Nashville, a journey he had taken many times before. It was July 9, 2018, and the plane hummed with the usual pre-flight activity. Flight attendants moved briskly up and down the aisles, passengers stowed their carry-ons, and the pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, welcoming everyone aboard and detailing the flight plan. David glanced out the window, watching the landscape below fade as the plane ascended. He had a long week ahead of him in Nashville, a series of business meetings and conferences that promised to be both exhausting and, hopefully, productive. With a sigh, he reclined his seat and decided to take a nap. Just a short one, he thought. 30 minutes into the flight, the steady hum of the engines lulled him to sleep. David awoke with a start, his body jolting as though he'd hit turbulence. His eyes snapped open, expecting to see the interior of the plane, the familiar rows of seats and the overhead compartments. Instead, he was surrounded by wooden walls, the air thick with the smell of coal and steam. The rhythmic chugging of a locomotive filled his ears, and the sound of steel wheels on iron tracks reverberated beneath him. Confusion washed over him as he looked around. He was no longer on a plane but in an old-fashioned train car. Passengers dressed in early 20th century attire sat around him, some reading newspapers, others chatting quietly. He glanced down at himself and saw that his clothes had changed too. He was wearing a suit that looked like it belonged in a history book. Panic gripped him. How was this possible? Was he dreaming? He pinched himself hard, but the scene around him remained unchanged. David stood up, his heart racing, and made his way down the narrow aisle, searching for answers. As he moved through the train, he noticed a plaque on the wall that read Locomotive Number 281. David's mind raced as he tried to make sense of his situation. Locomotive Number 281, why did that sound familiar? He racked his brain, trying to recall where he had heard that number before. Then it hit him. The Great Train Wreck of 1918. He remembered reading about it in a history book years ago. On July 9, 1918, two trains, train number 1 pulled by locomotive number 281 and train number 4 pulled by locomotive number 282, had collided head-on near Nashville, Tennessee, in one of the deadliest train accidents in U.S. history. David's blood ran cold. Was that where he was? On that very train? He needed to find out more, but he had no idea how to navigate this strange world he had found himself in. He decided to speak to one of the conductors. "Excuse me," he said, approaching a man in a uniform. "Can you tell me where we are?" The conductor looked at him curiously. "We're on our way to Nashville, sir. We'll be arriving shortly." David's heart pounded in his chest. He had to warn them, had to do something to prevent the disaster. And the date? What date is it today? The conductor raised an eyebrow. Why, it's July 9th, 1918. David's mind raced as he tried to think of a way to prevent the impending disaster. He couldn't just blurt out that he was from the future and knew what was going to happen. No one would believe him. He needed to come up with a plausible reason to stop the train. "There's something wrong with the tracks ahead," he said urgently. "I've just received word. We need to stop the train immediately." The conductor frowned. "And who exactly did you receive this word from?" David's mind scrambled for a believable answer. I work for the railroad company. I'm an inspector. There was a mix-up, and I was supposed to board at the last station to check for issues on the line ahead." The conductor looked skeptical but seemed to consider David's words. "I need to inform the engineer," he said finally. "Wait here." David watched as the conductor made his way to the front of the train. He could feel the eyes of the other passengers on him, their curious and suspicious glances making him even more anxious. Minutes felt like hours as he waited for the conductor to return. Suddenly, the train lurched violently, throwing David off balance. He stumbled and fell to the floor as the sounds of screams and grinding metal filled the air. The train shuddered and groaned, and David knew with a sickening certainty that they had collided with the other train. Chaos erupted around him. Passengers were thrown from their seats, luggage and belongings scattered everywhere. David struggled to his feet, the acrid smell of smoke and steam filling his nostrils. He needed to get out, to help those who were injured, but his mind was clouded with fear and confusion. He made his way to the nearest exit, pushing through the panic-stricken crowd. The sight that greeted him outside was one of utter devastation. The two trains had collided head-on, their engines crumpled and twisted together. Wreckage was strewn across the tracks, and injured passengers lay everywhere, crying out for help. David's heart ached with the knowledge that he had failed. He had tried to prevent the disaster, but it had happened anyway. He moved among the injured, doing what he could to help, but the sense of helplessness was overwhelming. Hours later, as the sun began to set, rescue teams arrived on the scene. David watched numbly as they tended to the injured and began the grim task of recovering bodies. He felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to see the conductor standing beside him, his face pale and drawn. "I don't know who you are," the conductor said quietly, "but you tried to warn us. You did your best." David nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "I just wish it had been enough." The conductor looked at him with a mixture of sympathy and confusion. "Where will you go now?" David didn't have an answer. He didn't even know how he had ended up here in the first place. All he knew was that he needed to find a way back to his own time, to make sense of what had happened. As night fell, David wandered away from the wreckage, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. He found a quiet spot away from the chaos and sat down, exhaustion washing over him. He closed his eyes, hoping that when he opened them again, he would be back in 2018, on a plane bound for Nashville. When David opened his eyes, he was no longer by the train tracks. He was back in his seat on the plane, the familiar hum of the engines filling his ears. He sat up, looking around in confusion. Had it all been a dream? It had felt so real. He checked his watch and saw that only a few minutes had passed since he had fallen asleep. The plane was still cruising smoothly, the other passengers oblivious to the turmoil he had just experienced. David took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing heart. As the plane descended into Nashville, David couldn't shake the feeling that what he had experienced was more than just a dream. It had been too vivid, too detailed. He had seen the faces of the injured, smelled the smoke and steam, felt the impact of the collision. When the plane landed and he disembarked, David felt a strange sense of déjà vu as he walked through the airport. He made his way to his hotel, his mind still reeling from the experience. That night, he couldn't sleep. He kept replaying the events of the day in his mind, trying to make sense of it all. In the days that followed, David couldn't stop thinking about the train wreck. He found himself researching the Great Train Wreck of 1918, reading everything he could find about it. The details matched perfectly with what he had experienced, right down to the numbers of the locomotives and the date of the collision. He couldn't explain how or why it had happened, but he knew that it had been real. Somehow, he had been transported back in time, given a chance to witness history firsthand. And though he had failed to prevent the disaster, he had tried his best. David decided to visit the site of the wreck. He drove out to the countryside near Nashville, following the directions he had found online. When he arrived, he stood in silence, looking at the memorial that had been erected to honor the victims of the tragedy. He felt a strange sense of peace as he stood there, knowing that he had been a part of something much larger than himself. And though he would never fully understand what had happened, he knew that he would carry the memory of that day with him for the rest of his life. As he left the site and drove back to the city, David couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude. He had been given a glimpse into the past, a chance to witness history in a way that few people ever could. And though the experience had been terrifying and confusing, it had also been a profound reminder of the fragility of life and the importance of every moment. David knew that he would never forget the events of July 9, 1918, and the lessons he had learned from that fateful day. And as he continued on with his life, he carried with him the knowledge that sometimes the most unexpected experiences can teach us the most important lessons of all.